You can help support the channel by heading to our merchandise store and picking up some of our great aircraft designs created by our graphic designer. We have everything from fighters to transport aircraft, which you can choose to have printed on t-shirts, mugs, stickers and much more. Head to the description below and click the links and pick up your design today. Thank you and enjoy. So Michelle, when did you become interested in aviation?
At an early age, I was always, we went to several air shows when I was a kid. My father was in the Air Force. He was a sergeant supply tech. And there were odd air shows here and there, and we always lived next to an airport. So I was interested, but we were not in a financial position for me to take any type of aviation training. From an early age, but it grew more passionate as time went on.
Absolutely. So what year did you actually join the Air Force and can you explain some of the aircraft you started training on in your basic time?
Absolutely. Um, a little bit more background. I graduated from high school. I was 16 years old. I went to college, was intending to go to med school. Plans changed and ended up going to the recruiting center. And they said, "Do you want to be a pilot?" I went, "Hey, that sounds interesting." Went to the aircrew selection process and crashed the simulator during the pilot selection program. So they offered me navigator, and I actually joined the military 20 days after my 18th birthday. Because I was French Canadian, my education was done in English. I didn't require any language training, so I went to basic training. Signed up on the 14th of December, 1979. Left for basic training on the 6th of January 1980. And then out of basic training, went right to the navigation school. Did a little bit of on-job training for about 5 months. Started my training. And that training was on the C-130 Hercules. That was the platform that the Royal Canadian Air Force was using at the time to train navigators. And upon completion of my navigator training in May of 81, I had 1 week to drive myself, which is about a 4-day drive, to my OTU, which was 410 Squadron, which was on Voodoos. So my entire time during training was on C-130s.
That's really interesting. And at this time, did you know what aircraft you wanted to go on to? Did you always want to go to the Voodoo or did you want to go to multi-engine or what was your plan?
No, it was the Voodoo. When I went to aircrew selection, sorry, to the recruiting center, when we were talking about navigators, I went, "What the heck is a navigator?" So the guy goes, "Well, you can fly helicopters on the back of ships, you can fly maritime patrol aircraft, you can fly transport aircraft, or you can fly Voodoos." And I had been to Chicoutimi, where my squadron, 425 squadron, was on a student exchange when I was in high school, and I went, "That's not a bad place. There's 5 girls for every guy. It's a beautiful area." And I went, yeah, so from the time I signed on the dotted line, my objective was to become a navigator on Voodoos at 425 Squadron in Chicoutimi, and that's exactly where I ended up by chance.
That's incredible. So let's get on to the Voodoo. And this is a first for the channel, everyone. So it's great to have you with us here, Michelle. But
Thank you.
so you moved on to the Voodoo. I'm guessing that was like a high prized jet everyone wanted to go onto or aircraft. What did you think? Were you good enough for your grades to get this aircraft?
Well, that was interesting. When I went through my navigator course, there were 8 students, and the normal aircraft split was 2 fighters, 2 transport, 2 maritime helicopter, and 2 maritime patrol aircraft. We were a weird bunch, not from the students, but it just happened that we were upgrading from our Argus to our Aurora, which is similar to the P3 for maritime patrol. And we were in the process of purchasing a new fighter to replace the Voodoo, the 104, and the F5. So we didn't think there'd be a lot of demand to go to Voodoos, but our course ended up asking for 3 fighter slots, 3 helicopter slots, 1 maritime patrol, and 1 transport, not expecting to get that. And we ended up with 3 fighter slots, 3 helicopter slots, and then 2 transport slots. And the 2 guys that were maritime patrol and transport were perfectly happy with that. So I finished 8 out of 8. My class was known as the Sweat Hogs. We did the absolute minimum to pass the exam, and I was right at the bottom of the class. But we did reasonably well on the course. And once I got to the Voodoo, it was a complete reversal. I was determined to stay in Bagotville because the training squadron was there, and 425, the French Canadian squadron, was there. And I worked my butt off on the Voodoo OTU and finished top of the class and got my first choice to go to my squadron right there in Bagotville.
Brilliant stuff. So let's get into some detail about the Voodoo.
Sure.
What was the aircraft's role at the time you joined, and was it a similar role when you entered service with the Canadian Air Force?
Absolutely. So the history of the Voodoo in the Canadian Air Force is that in the late 50s, the Avro Arrow, and it was going to be the frontline fighter in North America. In Europe, it was going to replace the F-86, the CF-100 Canuck that was built in Canada, and it was going to do weird and wonderful things. The program got canceled in the late 50s, early 60s, and the Americans offered F-101s, F-104s, Beaumark missiles as a deal to get us away from building the Arrow. So the 101s that we received, the first batch in 1961, were air interceptors, and we flew those aircraft in the air interceptor role. The first batch from 61 to 70, and the second batch from 70 to 84. There was one peculiar one where, as the Americans shut down their last Voodoo squadron in Texas, there was one airplane that had been modified as an electronic warfare aircraft that was resident in Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida. And the USAF offered it to Canada for free as long as we had it insured for $1 million. And the story behind that I'll explain a little bit later. But I was lucky enough to fly that airplane from 84 to 87 as an EW aircraft against the new F-18, against our new patrol frigates as simulating bombers and missiles, and against our ground radar stations. It was a lot of fun flying that airplane.
Absolutely. And did you feel was the right aircraft for the Canadian Air Force? Did they pick wisely, would you say?
Well, um, if you go back into Canadian history, every Canadian pilot would have loved for the Avro Arrow to complete its fruition into operations, because
We won't go there.
the radar the radar engineers went on to move to Hughes and build the F-14 radar. The engine guys moved to GE, built some of the best engines in the world, and many of the airframe guys moved on to Canadair and other American companies. The potential was there, but the project was way over budget. So this airplane was selected in the early 60s to go against the Russian bomber threat when the Tu-95 Bear was in its infancy, and it was absolutely the right airplane to do air intercept. Unlike the 104 that we ended up purchasing, which was designed as a high altitude, high speed interceptor, and we used it as a extreme low altitude nuclear bomb delivery platform, which it was not designed for, and we lost lots of 104s in Europe because of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you got the two-seater versions, or was there any single-seater versions in the Air Force for you guys?
They were all two-seat versions. The biggest difference between the first batch from 60 to 70 was they had an air-to-air refueling probe in the front, and they didn't have the infrared search and track system. And we never air-to-air refueled our airplanes. We didn't have the capability, and we didn't qualify our people to tank off American aircraft. But they were all two-seat versions. We didn't have any recce versions either. They were all air intercept versions.
Stuff. So can you talk us through some of your ground and flying training on the Voodoo?
So ground training was done, ground school in the classroom, simulator to get you used to the initial procedures. And so it was a fixed simulator, no movement, and then into the airplane. And we were literally, after the first 4 days of ground school, into the airplane, away you go. And I know one of your follow-on questions is, what was the first trip like? Well, I got to fly with the commanding officer of the training unit, who was a phenomenal pilot. And he goes, "Okay, I'm going to tell you to start your stopwatch. And when I do, I'll release the brakes and light the afterburner. And then you tell me how long it takes us to get to 30,000 feet." And it took 1 minute and 17 seconds to be at 30,000 feet inverted over the base. This thing went like a rocket.
Wow. And did you have to be prepared for that, or was it like did it like I mean, let's maybe back jump forward a bit. So if you did that every takeoff, did it just become normal, or was that excitement still there?
It was always exciting taking off in a Voodoo for a couple of reasons. First of all, the afterburner is not like the modern afterburners. It wasn't a gradual light. There's a 4 or 6 inch fuel line that feeds behind the jet airplane that fires raw fuel into the exhaust, and you go from 7,000 pounds of thrust to 50,000 pounds of thrust in about 2 seconds. The second part is the two, even though you push the throttles together and moved them into afterburner at the same time, didn't generally light at the same time. It could be up to 3 seconds apart, which meant some rather interesting directional control problems for the pilots. And we used to do formation takeoffs like that too. But yeah, it was the standard takeoff was afterburner, unless it was minus 30, and then we did full military takeoffs with no afterburner because the shock on the engine mounts were too hard when it was that cold. That's how much thrust was coming out of that thing. So let me give you the analogy to that too when it comes to fuel burn. When we were at normal 95% power in cruise, not an afterburner, we were burning about 6,000 pounds an hour. In afterburner, the airplane burned 100,000 pounds an hour. The airplane only carried 15,000 pounds. The shortest known flight, same pilot that took me on my first flight, his shortest flight was his last flight. He took off in afterburner. The DCO of the squadron took off in a second airplane in afterburner. They went straight up over the base, stayed in afterburner the whole time, and landed 7 minutes later out of gas.
That's incredible. That is amazing.
So you use the afterburner when you need it, not all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk a bit about the cockpits, and especially your cockpit. What systems would you be using at the time?
So in the air intercept version, I had the radar in the back that had, for a 1970s airplane, some very capable electronic countermeasures. And this became important when we were going against B-52s or other aircraft that had some very good jamming capability. Other than that, I had a true airspeed indicator and a compass. I didn't have an attitude indicator. I didn't have an airspeed indicator. I didn't have most of the instruments that the pilot had in the front. And the pilot didn't have the radar indications that I had. He had a little scope with a dot. When I locked on to an airplane, the dot steered him to where he was supposed to fire the missile. So it was kind of a limited cockpit. And the radar wasn't a day visible radar. So we had something called a muff that sat on top of it. And of course, it's not in the middle of the cockpit. My back is permanently ruined by leaning forward and into the muff to look at the radar, and pilots pulling 6G while your face is twisted sideways into that. So it was interesting. Other than that, you had the radar controls on the right-hand side that almost like a stick on an airplane, but it allowed you to control all the different modes for the radar, and and about 75 circuit breakers for everything known to man in the airplane. They were all in the back.
Yeah. So was it a comfy cockpit for yourself?
It was known as the Cadillac compared to, I was also trained on a T-33 when I was there. That was by far the smallest cockpit other than the Cessna 150 that I've ever crawled into. The Voodoo was like sitting in a giant lazy boy, super roomy, super comfortable. It was a very nice airplane to fly compared to the 104, the F5 that had much tighter cockpits, which made it a little easier because we at the last 2 years of the airplane. Remember, this airplane is designed to climb up to 30, 40, 50,000 feet, cruise along, and then fire nuclear missiles or infrared missiles at bombers coming the other way. It was not designed to do air combat. In the last 2 years, as the guys were getting ready to move to the F-18, we started doing air combat with the airplanes. And within about 18 months, we grounded 15 Voodoos for cracked wings
Wow.
and leading edges, and we beat the crap out of those airplanes by the end of their career. There was
Yeah.
one last thing is what was nice about the cockpit is there were two handles up by the canopy, and I could grab a handle and turn around and get a pretty good view out the back. Plus, we had a mirror, so when we're doing air combat, now you're pulling 6G, but you're completely twisted around trying to look backward to see where the other guy is.
Well, we're going to get onto that because I do like that kind of subject, and maybe you do have a couple of stories for us there, Michelle. But yeah, so
Sounds
what was
good.
it like actually like to fly and operate, and maybe can you share some of the strengths and weaknesses of the aircraft?
Strengths, lots of power, good range. When we were flying double tanked, we could probably go 1,000 miles in any direction. And very good. I did 4 intercepts off the east coast of Russian bombers. Three of them were bombers heading south to Cuba. The fourth one was the first time Bear Foxtrots were heading north back to Russia. And we got some good pictures of that. It had some good speed. The fastest I went was Mach 1.7.
Ooh.
The ceiling was 50,000 feet. I may have been to 54,500 feet on a test flight, and it was good. It was some of the weaknesses, horrible turning airplane. Didn't have a big wing. And when you racked on as much G as you could at the best turning speed, you were lucky to get about 10 to 12 degrees per second. That is a
Wow.
very slow turn. And I can tell you one of the funniest lectures we ever received was launching of a nuclear missile. So the class is 30 minutes long. There's not much to it. You basically go find the bombers and you go nose to nose with them as fast as possible because that'll give you the longest launch distance. And then you launch and you have 8 seconds before the nuclear weapon goes off. So as soon as the missile goes off, the pilot's to bank 90 degrees and pull as hard as he can. He will get to about 90 degrees when the explosion and the flash goes off, which will peel the paint off the bottom of the airplane. And if we continue and stay supersonic and run away, we'll stay ahead of the shockwave. Any questions? That was the class.
That was it.
That was it. And oh yeah, the pilot, if we were actually carrying nuclear weapons, the pilot and the navigator would have an eye patch, and you'd have a lead eye
Yeah.
patch on one eye. And when the first missile went off, you'd lose eyesight, you'd switch it over. And when the second missile went off, it was like, good luck. But remember, I remember having the conversation with the Padre when I was going. He says, Michelle, you're Catholic. You're about to go to an airplane that carries nuclear weapons and is designed to kill the enemy. I said, Padre, if I'm in an airplane and I'm over Canadian soil and I'm not launching nuclear missiles at Russian bombers, we have bigger things to worry about. There's probably isn't even an airfield back to where I'm going. So
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
it was an interesting lecture. Yeah.
30 minutes. That's great, Michelle. So, but you mentioned before, like, let's talk about a bit about dogfighting or ACM. So, have you got a couple of stories then how the Voodoo actually fared? Because obviously that wasn't your main role or the aircraft's main role.
No. Another kind of this one's a very peculiar issue to the Voodoo. With the low wing and a reasonably small wing compared to other aircraft and a high T-tail, the airplane had a very bad habit of two things: roll coupling. So you could roll this thing at 720 degrees per second. So it would do two full spins in 1 second.
Mhm.
But as you're spinning, the bulk of the weight is down where the engines are. So that's not lined up with the nose of the airplane, the tail of the airplane, and the wings. The line of roll and the center of gravity are not in line. So after 720 degrees, the airplane starts to roll couple. And we had the standard rule was you cannot pull G and roll at the same time. And we had an airplane at an air show in BC where they were coming out of a loop and then they were supposed to pull up and roll, and he hadn't stopped pulling G when he started to roll. And halfway through, three-quarters of the way through the first roll, the left engine left the airplane. The airplane was the fireball. The two guys ejected out through the fireball. Both survived. Minor burns. Their flying suits were gone, burnt off, but they had minor burns, and the airplane crashed about 6 miles off the airport. You can look it up. It's the Voodoo crash at the Abbotsford Airport. So that was one issue, the roll coupling. The other one is the airplane did not stall. The airplane pitched up. So if you get it up to the stall point, all of a sudden the airplane literally pitches up and goes out of control. And the only way to recover out of that is use the drag chute that we normally use for landing. The drag chute has the equivalent of 10,000 pounds of reduction or thrust. So it would get the airplane going straight down. If you pitched up below 10,000 feet, you ejected. You didn't have enough time for the airplane to parachute open, start going down, accelerate, drop the chute, and recover the airplane. So those are kind of two major things that you need to know when you start doing air combat with an airplane. Now, we had some of the best pilots in the Air Force land the Voodoo at the time. I'm only familiar of one pitch up in Chatham, and the issue wasn't that the guy wasn't paying attention. He happened to go through the jet wash of the airplane he was chasing while he was pulling 6G, and the airplane snapped, pitched up, and they were at 13,000 feet. By the time they realized what was going on, they were already at 9,000 feet. They both ejected, both survived. Two good friends. One of them had a broken collarbone. The other one was fine.
So yeah, it's like talking about ACM. So what would you be? Would you be training against each other, or would you be going up against the F5s, or what would you be going up against to train like in this?
We train a bunch against a variety of airplanes. For a good EW target, we go against B-52s and 111s from the U.S. who had a low-level route close to our base. For ACM, we used to fight the F5s on our base. We used to fight each other. We'd go against A-10s. So you talk about a complete mismatch. The A-10 can turn, I think it's about 30 degrees per second. So they could do circles around us, but we had speed like they're slow and we could be in and out and carry on. We did some training with American F4s, F-15s, F-106s, and then we'd end up going to Maple Flag where you fight with whoever shows up. So the French, the Brits, the Germans. I flew against Harriers, F-105s, Buccaneers, F-16s, yeah, anything that shows up to Maple Flag. So I got a good variety of different things that we fought. The standard was we were fast, so it was like take a shot and get out of the fight. As soon as you started to turn, we'd bleed off airspeed, and we were slow. And we had one guy who decided had he was fighting with an F-15. The F-15 rolled in behind him about 45 degrees, and he did every maneuver known to man, overstressed the airplane in every axis. And the video shows a Voodoo gyrating in the middle of the pipper on the F-15. He just kept putting bullets into the airplane. So yeah,
That's interesting.
she was a
So
bit of
yeah,
a
just
dog.
yeah. So let's talk a bit about Maple Flag. Just going off on a bit of a tangent here,
Sure.
Michelle. What was that like turning up at Maple Flag with? I guess I'm going to put in retro aircraft, and they got the F-15s, the F-16s, the Harriers there. What was that like, and how did all the other participants view the Voodoo?
It was interesting. First of all, our airplanes were painted up a nice gray with a big lightning bolt down the side and a big Canada. And three-quarters of the other people are camouflaged airplanes. So the first thing we did was get water paint and literally paint all the airplanes camouflage. Some of them look like chocolate bars. Some of them look like your standard green and brown camouflage. We did anything we wanted to the airplanes to try to get them to. And as soon as you went through a cloud, you lost 25% of your camouflage. but it was interesting. We had some fun fights with some airplanes who sometimes we sacrificed one or two airplanes to get two more that were hidden in the corner and take shots. And the modern airplanes did not like being on the kill sheet for the Voodoos. I can tell you that much.
Oh,
What is this airplane that was built in the 1960s taking a shot at me for? But it was good training. I played both on Blue Force and Red Force when I was out there, and it was very, very interesting.
And you're probably certainly the coolest aircraft out there. I mean, nothing looks like a Voodoo. So, like, yeah, you've got the looks over there.
If you put the cool airplanes in there, B-52s, B-1s, the F-105 Thunder Chief, and I was in an airplane where we actually caught one that was not going as fast as we thought. And as soon as we locked up, all you saw was the back end light up. He lit his afterburner and he was gone. He was doing at least 300 knots faster than we were. And we were as fast as the jet would go. So, yeah. 111s were the same. When we used to go chase 111s on the low level route in northern Quebec, we try to sneak up on them in infrared because as soon as we turned the radar on, it was jammer on and then one afterburner, two afterburner, gone.
That's incredible. Yeah, I thought that, like, yeah,
Yeah.
the Voodoo will be able to keep up with, the F-111 B-1B. I thought, like, it'd be quite good on the deck.
No, our limit was 600 knots down low. Up at altitude, we could do 1.7 Mach, but down low, you were pushing a brick through air. It's almost like an F4. It like you can bend the throttles all you want. She's going to go about 610, 620, and too much friction. But
Nice. That
but
was.
you can melt ice off the wing in about 10 seconds at that speed.
But Michelle, you mentioned getting scrambled against some bears. Can you maybe talk a bit about that? Because they sound really interesting. Share that with our viewers.
I'll try to stay away from the classified part. So basically, we held
Okay.
alerts for a variety of things in Bagotville, and one of them was the bear, and we'd be notified that we had an intercept time out there, so we'd launch out of Bagotville, go to the East Coast, refuel, and then we'd launch at the appropriate time to get out there about the time that the bears would be transiting our area of operation. The intercepts were actually quite interesting. First of all, it's the middle of the Cold War. They're Cold Warriors that we think are 10 feet tall. They're flying a propeller-driven airplane that can go as fast as our airplane, which is kind of interesting. And then when you pull up to them, we're over the North Atlantic. Even in the summer, life expectancy isn't very long. In the winter, it's very short. So these guys are leaving Russia on their way to Cuba where there's rum, cigars, and women. They have no interest in messing with us. And we're 300 miles off the coast of Newfoundland. We have no interest in going for a swim either. So it was typically very friendly. We'd pull up on the wing, we'd take pictures of them, they'd take pictures of us. Yeah, there was the standard wave. Sometimes a Playboy or a Coca-Cola bottle would show up, and then we'd head back. Just let him know that we had the capability to go out there, and we were armed. And it's just a friendly hi, how are you? What's very interesting is fast forward to 2003. I'm on my squadron as a squadron commander in Winnipeg in a C-130 squadron, and I get tasked with a crew to go over and do open skies missions 1 week in Ukraine and 1 week in Russia. And when we end up in Russia, we end up having a lunch, our entire crew, with a Russian fighter pilot, a Russian bomber pilot, a Russian tanker pilot. So me and the bomber pilot, were sitting next to each other, and we start talking through a young lieutenant who spoke Russian and English about when were you flying bombers and so on. And we figured we may have met over the North Atlantic 30 years before or 20 years before then when we were flying. So it's kind of cool. Small world.
Absolutely. And what missiles or like ammunition would you be carrying on these like scrambles for bears?
So the Voodoo carried two weapons. It carried the Genie, which was a nuclear tipped, unguided. So you're just firing a nuclear bullet forward, and you're hoping that it explodes over or near the bomber. And it's not the flash. The flash will blind the pilots, but it's the overpressure from the explosion that will literally snap the wings off the bomber. The other one we carried so there were two Genies, and there were two AIM-4D Falcon heat-seeking missiles, and those went together because they were literally first-generation infrared missiles, and had a PK that was well less than 100%. It was in the 60s, 70s, I think. I can't remember. You can probably find it on the internet. So these things would go off together. The only time we ever fired the weapons was when we were down in Tyndall doing missile qualifications, and we were firing time-expired missiles. The Genie didn't care. It was non-guided, so it went out and did its thing. And it was like a train leaving the airplane, the one I fired. And the infrared missiles were normally, the first one would go dumb. It had a bad seeker head. And the second one would lock onto the first one and follow it into the water. So that's the nature of the beast. Reality is non-time expired missiles would probably work just fine as infrared and find the target.
So I've always been fascinated with this as well. Before we move on, Michelle, did you ever contact them via radio when you're formating on the bears?
My formations, we did not. We did have one pilot on our squadron that was fluent in Polish, and Polish and Russian is close. So he kind of studied a couple of Russian lines to just say hello and a couple of things, and they never answered. We don't even know if they were monitoring we were on our frequencies, but he went on guard and tried communicating with them on guard and never got a response. So.
And you also mentioned earlier in the interview that you flew. Is it the EF-101, or was it the electronic version? Can you tell us about that?
So the EF-101. So the Americans were looking for a high-speed EW platform. They did have Wild Weasels, which is more of an attack airplane than a jammer. They had the E6B, but the E6B was Navy, had a really good jamming kit, but most of the time was deployed. The EF-111s, same thing, very good and capable airplane, but they're busy doing their own stuff. So the Americans wanted to have a high-speed target they could use for training in Tyndall. So they modified one. They took the radar out. They took they basically used the bomb bay to put the three jammers, the transformer rectifiers required for the jammers. And then they put the three jamming antennas right behind the cockpit that did forward and backward. Hang on a sec. The ones behind the cockpit went backward. There were some forward, and we had receiver antennas that were on the top of the nose and in the back. Where the infrared, the cool globe that's in the front there, that was replaced by a small antenna that was the receiver for our APR 9, I think, was the receiver we had. So we could receive most of the fighter frequencies, and we had 3 India band jammers that were 500 watts apiece. So we had a fair amount of juice that we could throw in to a radar. And even when we were flying against the newer radars, they were having some issue. We tended to put too much energy, very concentrated, into somebody's receiving antenna that caused them issues.
Yeah. And did you ever swap notes with the Prowler guys or the EF-111 guys to see how you did things?
Well, funny enough, before I went to the EW Squadron, I went to the 453rd Electronic Warfare Training Squadron in Sacramento. And there were 2 courses they gave. They gave their standard USAF course, and they gave an international course. Canadians were the only ones that were allowed on the USAF course. So myself and one other guy were on a course with 15 other Americans that were navigators who had finished their training, had gone over to the EW school, and they were going to B-52s, EF-111s, F-4Gs, and there's one more. B-52, 111, F-4. Oh, that's right. We had 2 Marines, and they were going to E-6Bs.
Yeah, they're probably.
So we went through the whole training with these guys. The only section we weren't allowed to do was the B-52 because there were classified systems on it. But we went through all the theory and the practical in the simulator, and doing Wild Weasel missions, doing the F-111 missions. So yeah, I had some buddies who were now on those airplanes, and yeah, we tended to meet at Maple Flag or Red Flag or Green Flag or what's the one, Copper Flag down in
Yeah.
Tyndall, and we'd swap stories. Had a lot of fun. When I was on 414, we also had so we had the Black Voodoo. We had another one, a dual, so the pilots could keep up their instrument ratings and stuff like that. We had 3 Falcons that had really good jamming suites on board, including comm jamming and amazing chaff capability with fiberglass chaff. And we also had 15 T-33s that could carry jamming pods and chaff dispensers. So as a team, when we went somewhere, although they were all older airplanes, we could create a lot of problems for new airplanes.
Yeah. So, which mission did you actually prefer on the Voodoo? You flying yourself in the back seat?
The first squadron's always your love squadron. When I was doing the intercept, like literally, I got to my squadron operational 4 days before my 20th birthday. Most technicians on the squadron were older than I was, and I was the last navigator to join my squadron. There was one more pilot who joined the squadron, and then 3 years later, uh, yeah, 3 years later, we were one of the first squadrons to shut down to convert to F-18s. So it was a lot of fun flying the big silver jet in Afterburner all over the place. The second summer I was on the squadron, I was on the formation team, so we did 7 air shows that summer. I did static displays in the US. And those were the days where you could sign out an airplane for the weekend and go wherever you want. So we could take a T-Bird or a Voodoo down to Virginia Beach or Dayton, Ohio, go to the museum there, or go to Texas or wherever. So it was the absolute best life. I got 4 intercepts of Russian bombers in the middle of the Cold War. We used to, the other mission I did enjoy when I was on the AW squadron was we used to deploy to Bermuda for a month every year to do Navy workups. And then there was a workup towards their qualification, and then there was a big exercise after that. So a month in Bermuda wasn't bad. We also spent a lot of time down in Tyndall, Florida in the middle of winter for major exercises. But 425, flying the big silver jet, doing air intercept, will always be my love.